That's really what this is about. Do we believe that the future of healthcare involves more information or less? And anybody who says it's less, I think they'll find themselves on the wrong end of history.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Jeffrey Kaditz, founder and CEO of QBio. In this episode, we discuss the company's clinical digital twin platform. Jeffrey shares his vision for building a Star Trek Medbay for preventative health diagnostics. Plus, we talk about the shortcomings of whole body MRIs, how Q's technology can predict health over time, and creating the automated physical exam of the future. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by Jack Taylor, our exclusive PR partner. More than just PR, they're creative storytellers and brand builders who actually understand the health and wellness industry. To learn more, head to fit.co/JackTaylor. That's FITT.co/JackTaylor. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, excited to chat today. A lot to get into, a space that I've been following for quite some time. We've covered on Fitt Insider in terms of preventative healthcare, the technology that's going into it, and the various approaches kind of across the board. But for folks who aren't familiar maybe with QBio and yourself, could you give us a quick intro and background, then we'll jump into it?
Sure. By training, I'm a high-energy physicist and computer scientist. I dropped out of grad school in 2003 and started my first company in Menlo Park. And now I've been doing that for 20 years. And now my fifth company, and the latest one is QBio. And I've been working on that for about 6.5 years. The easiest way to summarize it is we took a step back and we said, what is the missing technology that you'd have to invent in order to make a real working Star Trek Medbay? And by that, I mean a completely automated physical exam that didn't require any humans, like highly skilled labor, where you could measure anything about a human body. You can kind of think about it as an analog to digital conversion step as the ultimate physical exam. And then if you can do that, can you analyze that information and then recommend if a person needs to see a doctor, and if so, what kind? And so that's the kind of technological basis for what we've been trying to do. And the business case really is, if you look fundamentally, a lot of people talk about preventative care, but if we really want ubiquitous preventative care, there's a fact that you can't avoid, which is there's not enough doctors to see every person every year. That's unavoidable. So there's scarce, highly skilled healthcare resources, and there's a growing population, and that ratio is actually accelerating. So what that basically means is, unless we have a data-driven way to prioritize who gets access to scarce health resources, preventive care simply isn't possible. Like, it doesn't matter how good your AI diagnostics are or whatever it is, we're just not making doctors as fast as we make people. And so if we cannot prioritize who gets care in what order based on who will be the most expensive to care in the short term, and do that in an automated way, preventive care simply can't scale.
For sure. I think the premise and everything that you're laying out, both in terms of the convenience, the technology, the demand, the need for both people to seek out care, but also the limited kind of resources on the doctor side, like there is a definite need for this. But even as you're describing it, right, it's kind of like, this seems sci-fi. It seems impossible. It seems like the technology is not there. Our capabilities aren't there. And even to this point, a lot of what you have been working on is like behind the scenes. So how far are we between this idea and it being reality and some of the technology that is coming into play that's making it possible?
The technology is now certainly possible, and all the pieces will be in place before the end of this decade to do fully automated physical exams. And that includes not needing a phlebotomist to draw blood, like automated drawing of blood, point of care, blood and urine testing. Once you have those things, we've solved all the other problems really that you need to build a real working Star Trek Medbay. And so I think that's actually very close. And the bigger problem that I think we have is not a technological problem as much as it is a data problem. Like, we're now can measure so much more information so cheaply about the human body, right? When a whole body scan, non-invasive whole body scan, or something that gathers, I would say 100 times more information than an hour-long whole body MRI is available for less than the cost of a standard blood panel, which we can now do. It means that these very comprehensive physical exams where you gather an enormous amount of information about somebody are possible, but that's too much information for a human to interpret. And there's going to be a period of time, I think, where we can gather this much information. We're going to be learning how to interpret it and most effectively use it to both improve outcomes and minimize, costs.
To this point in developing, you said it's possible. It's definitely possible within the decade.
The biggest missing piece that we've worked on, there's kind of three components to it, and they're all tightly related. One is being able to build a software platform that can integrate, and basically this is what we call Gemini, a digital twin platform. Integrate any piece of information. Doesn't matter if it's the latest and greatest metabolomics or proteomics, whatever it is. Blood, genetics, urine analysis, saliva, anatomical information from a whole body scan, your medical history, symptoms. It can integrate all of this into a model of you, how you are changing over time. And then we have machine learning models that can actually summarize your greatest risks. Not only your greatest risks, things you can do to reduce those risks, but also what next steps should be. And next steps might be a certain kind of test that a doctor should order, or you should have a visit with a cardiologist, or maybe the next step is just come back in 24 months for your next physical exam. But we believe that that's what the future really looks like for preventive care, is where think about something like a car wash for your body, where actually we can set up these sites for about the same site it costs as a car wash and costs less to run than a car wash, and measure everything about your body in less than 30 minutes. And from that, tell you whether or not you need to see a doctor. So imagine if like there's kind of an automated triage layer that sat in front of the healthcare system, which really was the preventative layer. Because our feeling is that by the time you see a doctor, we should know that there's a reason to see the doctor rather than you just go see a doctor. Because again, there's not enough doctors to see every person every year. So unless you can automate the first step in the decision tree of is something wrong with this person? Do they need an intervention? Like you cannot simply scale preventative care.
Yeah, I think it's the ideal. Like it's even at this point, a lot of the conversation is about, we have the advancements in wearable technology and you have sensors that are measuring activity and steps and heart rate variability and glucose and working on non-invasive glucose monitoring. But as you describe it, taking it this next step further, that you're basically walking into whatever this site is, having the kind of top to bottom, inside and out, full scale physical done as a triage level to then knowing what's possible, not only kind of marking, hey, this is where you are today, potentially predicting and forecasting this is where you're going to be.
No, we actually have gotten pretty good at forecasting, and you can kind of think about actually the right way to think about it is we have these large language models, which are these large neural networks that are very good at predicting the next word in a sentence, right? What we've built are models that have these very large quantitative models of human biology that actually understand the relationships between genetics, biochemistry, behavior, anatomy. And so what we can do is actually make a forecast or a probability distribution of what a person's health will look like within a 3 to 5 year horizon. And from that, we can actually estimate their cost of care. And from that, you can say, well, let's prioritize this person getting care sooner because they're going to be more expensive. Maybe they have an existential risk. That there's a few things that allow us to do this that haven't been possible before. One is the integration of all this information into a single model about a person's health. We also use wearable information, but the difference between wearable information versus a physical exam is the wearable information, as I like to think of, is it's low fidelity, high frequency information, right? It's useful for understanding behavior, but in and of itself, it's hard to use to specifically isolate somebody who has a specific disease, right? The information in a physical exam, regardless of the frequency, which we think should be determined based on a person's risk factors, is that you're gathering enough information to have a pretty good idea if somebody has a disease or not. And so, like, there's low fidelity, high frequency information. There's low frequency, high fidelity information. But we think you need to join those longitudinally. So it's this multimodal, longitudinal model that we build that allows us to build these forecasts. And one of the biggest problems that we had to solve, besides building the software platform that could integrate all this information, is build a scanner that solved a lot of the problems that today whole body MRI has. And the three things that really are problematic about whole body MRI today, and there's a long historical reason why this is the case, is one, it's very unreproducible. It's dependent on the subject laying still, holding their breath correctly. It's dependent on the scanner. Even scanners of the same make and model from the same vendor can have different quality of images just because there's slight imperfections of them. Again, one of the biggest assumptions that has went into the building of MRI over the last 50 years is that these machines are perfect, but that's just never true. They're not the same, right? It's also dependent on the human operator. So you need to get rid of a human operator if you really want reproducibility. Lastly, it's just fundamentally not a quantitative modality. There are no error bars on an MRI image. So then you have to have a human interpret a subjective output. So there's just multiple levels from the human operator to the variability in the scanner to like the variability of the interpreter. All along the way, there's all these things that make it very unscientific and much more like an art. So you need to solve that. If you want to be able to measure what's changing in a person over time anatomically, to MRI as it is today does not work, right? The second problem is, and we've done one of the largest whole body reproducibility studies ever done, and for MRI, it turns out that about 40% of people we have offered to pay to get a whole body scan either couldn't hold their breath long enough to get a whole body MRI or got claustrophobic, right? And if you think about it, that means it's just the form factor isn't very friendly. If you want this to be actually, if you believe in a Star Trek future where whole body scan is just as common as getting some blood work done or a stethoscope being used, then that needs to be solved, the form factor, right? Lastly, the cost and speed, like the throughput is a problem. If you look at, there's a lot, I know there's companies out there saying a whole body MRI is now available directly to the consumer. The problem is that if you look at just the number of MRI scanners in the world per capita and the spare capacity on them, there's just simply not enough of it because it's too slow. And honestly, especially in the United States, reimbursement rates are so high for an MRI scan. Why would you ever be, you're not going to be able to rent time on that scanner for a price that's reasonable enough to be available for the average person, right? And so it really requires a much cheaper kind of hardware that can gather more information much faster. And we've solved those problems. And that's kind of one of the key breakthroughs that we've had that allow for us to do this.
Yeah, I want to dig into how exactly you're doing that now and what it looks like. But first, on this point of the whole body MRI and kind of the number of companies over the last 5-ish years that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars at this point who are opening locations across the country and really touting this as the next evolution era in personalized preventative care. You're kind of saying on a number of levels, for a number of reasons, that's just incorrect. Where do you think the
Well,
gap in the
I'm
understanding
not
and the
saying,
marketing?
look, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do if you have the money. I'm just saying that in order for it to be a standard of care, these problems need to be solved. Otherwise, it's going to be a niche product for a wealthy demographic. And you can do the math very simply. You just count, like just in the United States, for example, count the number of total whole body MRIs that can actually perform a whole body MRI. And just because you have a whole body MRI scanner doesn't mean you can do a whole body MRI, because some of them are so old that a person would need to get out, turn around to get back in, or they don't have the right coils. So there's a lot of intricacies to like, is it even possible or feasible to do even an hour-long whole body MRI? But if you just count the number of existing MRI scanners installed in the United States, and then you do an estimate on the spare capacity of what there is, you can really quickly figure out that, I mean, if you were to dedicate all of the MRI scanners in the United States to just whole body MRI, you could scan up almost 2% of the United States population a year. And that's if you didn't use it for anything else, which obviously is ridiculous because it's also valuable as a kind of acute symptomatic diagnostic tool. And that's really the thing about MRIs. As it is invented today, it's really optimized for acute symptomatic diagnostics, not as a discovery tool for finding issues. Because if you wanted to be able to find issues, you need a certain level of reproducibility, because the reproducibility also helps you automate the interpretation, right? And so to get to a scalability in a price point and a level of automation that's not just based on what I would say, there's some major problems with people who think you can just use computer vision to build an AI radiologist. Specifically, like, again, if you don't have reproducibility between scanners, right? If you train a network on a scanner where there's too much variability between it and another scanner, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you train on one scanner, it works on another. And so that's really important. It's just not a quantitative modality. And that's just because they're not designed to be. It's a very difficult problem to solve, actually, it turns out, if you want to make it a quantitative modality, because it requires solving not an AI problem or a machine learning problem, but actually kind of a computational physics problem that had yet to be solved.
Yeah, and talking about then this approach, a much different approach than relying on a whole body MRI scanner. You mentioned building your own scanners, having the software that integrates all of this, being able to interpretate it and know what it means and forecast based on those digital twin models. A lot of this has been done at Q behind the scenes to this point, right? Kind of behind closed doors, although what's public anyway,
Yeah, I mean, what we did is like, our business was never to be a whole body MRI company. What we first said is we know we need to build something that can replace MRIs that exist today if it's going to be used as a preventative tool. If we want the Star Trek whole body scanner where you can do a very rapid, quantitative, non-invasive scan, like that's just not what MRI is today. But we also knew that we needed to build a software platform that could integrate all of this information, like genetics, chemistry, in a way that, regardless of the innovations and new kinds of chemical analysis that could be done about the body, it could seamlessly be integrated into our model of a person. We need to build this software platform under the assumption we could solve the scalability problem of the whole body scan. So behind the scenes, what we did is we said, okay, well, we know there's a lot of wealthy people who will pay us to get early access to a tool that will let them track all of these things about their body. But in the meantime, what that really allowed us to do is prototype and build the software platform that could start to understand and make relationships between all of this information, this kind of what might be called multimodality information. And if you're like into the buzzwords of like the most recent kind of years of machine learning. But from our perspective, it's always been about integrating all of this information. And because we have a lot of physicists in our company and biologists, as well as people who, a lot of computer scientists, AI people. But if you're a physicist, the idea of multimodal models to describe a physical system and make forecasts about it is just, it's not even a thing. That's just the way you do physics. Right. And so the idea in medicine now, people are talking about these multimodal diagnostics or risk models. Like to us, that was just obviously the case that it's going to be that way. Why would you like imagine if Google or Netflix tried to predict what movie you would watch or what ad you would click on based on a single piece of information? That would be extremely limiting. It would lead to very fragile models. And I think we see that a lot. Like a lot of people talk about false positive rates in MRI, and we've made huge inroads on improving this by a number of ways. One is by having longitudinal information. The other is multimodality information. And the third is by making the whole body scan truly quantitative. Because what this means is we can actually start to learn what the properties of healthy and diseased tissue are from a quantitative perspective versus in an MRI image, you just see bright or dark. If you actually read an MRI, a radiologist report of an MRI, they say hypointense lesion or hyperintense lesion. That is just fancy talk for bright or dark. That's not a measurement of tissue. What we're actually able to do now is extract measurements of the tissue and say, okay, is this similar to diseased tissue we've seen before or healthy tissue we've seen before in this part of the body? And that actually dramatically boosts sensitivity and specificity.
So, in its current state, if I were to walk and do the scan and have the full experience, what does that look like today relative to what you hope or intend it to look like as this, first layer of triage to preventative care?
Well, today we use a modified GE scanner that has a little bit of our technology on it. The only thing we did is install some of our technology in it to reduce breath holds, and that was just to make it a little bit more comfortable for the people who have participated in the kind of early adoption of our platform. And it takes about an hour to gather vitals, blood, urine, saliva, and from that we get genetics and your biochemistry. We aggregate your medical history, and then we do this whole body scan where we can look at about 400 different organs and tissue types to look for anomalies, which then helps our radiologists kind of triage the volume that we get. But we haven't really been optimizing for kind of commercialization. We've been just really trying to prove out the technology. Now with the scanner that we've built, that we've begun manufacturing, we can actually do these whole exams about a tenth the price and about 5 times faster. And so I think what it means is the difference between a single site being able to scan 1,000 to 1,500 people a year on existing MRI scanners that we haven't modified to one that can do 10 to 15,000 people a year and costing less than $1 million to set up a site versus $3 to $4 million to set up a site. So those are the way the scaling and the economics work with our technology versus trying to use an existing technology.
And is that experience, this technology, inclusive of, you mentioned vitals and blood work and all of these aspects being automated, rather, that's already occurring?
Well, the only part that I'm not working on automate, but I'm very aware of companies that are. And the only part that prevents us from doing the Star Trek exam where in about 25 minutes, everything is measured. And by the time you leave, you get a notification on your phone that gives the analysis. The only missing pieces are automating the blood and urine draw and analysis at the point of care, so you don't have to ship it to a lab. The slowest and most expensive part of what we do by far is doing the biochemical analysis. And I know that's confusing to people because people think, oh, well, blood testing or urine testing is a standard part of the physical exam. I can tell you that the cost of a whole body scan within 2 years will be 10 times cheaper than a standard metabolic panel that your doctor orders.
Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a second. But first, I wanted to tell you about our exclusive PR partner, Jack Taylor. Honestly, this one's a no-brainer. We've known the Jack Taylor team for years. They work with some of the most innovative health and wellness companies. We're talking Whoop, Athletic Greens, Hyperice, and many more. Jack Taylor has an extensive industry network, knows how to work with high-growth companies, and really invests in building long-term relationships. I know this firsthand because they're Fitt Insider's PR agency, so I can confidently recommend them, and I do all the time. From startups to more established brands, they go beyond pushing product to help companies truly thrive. To learn more, head to fit.co/Jack Taylor. That's FITT.co/Jack Taylor. Now back to the show. And in terms of doing this lab work, accelerating it to the point where you can make it happen kind of on-site and faster, do you imagine building that technology as well? Or
No, I think we would rely on third-party partners. We're already in conversations with them about it because our insight was that no one was solving the whole body, scalable whole body scanning problem. There's other people working on point of care and more scalable or rapid and cheaper blood and or biochemical analysis. And let's say with DNA analysis, right? And then you have all this kind of a lot of these liquid biopsy companies popping up, but we just see them as other kinds of biochemical analysis, really, that could plug into our model. And so the idea was to build a platform that could integrate all of this to build true personalized health forecasts. And in some ways, you can imagine this as being kind of an AI clinician's assistant or your AI personal health assistant. But in order to do this in a comprehensive way, we knew we had to scale the ability to collect quantitative anatomical information, which up to this point was not possible. Like the ability for us to measure what is quantitatively changing about, let's say, your liver from well, not just morphologically, but from the properties of it very cheaply and very quickly, like that really hasn't existed before. And so we had to solve that problem so we could complete this idea of we can build a digital model of somebody's physiology and then make forecasts about it.
And as all this gets refined from a technology standpoint, it sounds like now opening more locations where you can do this. Do you envision it being a subscription model where I'm paying to have this done on a recurring basis as a member of this, of QBio and of the broader platform? Or is this like a one-off? I can come back from time to time. Have you figured out what that looks like membership or business model wise from the user standpoint?
We have a number of partners that we're beginning to roll out with internationally, and we're exploring lots of different options. I think there's a lot of compelling ways that this can be delivered. And the reality is the way it gets delivered is kind of somewhat dependent on the system it's being integrated with and what the incentives of that system are. And they're different. And from our perspective, we're a provider of technology that facilitates true preventative care for the first time, scalable preventative care. And so we're open to partnering with different partners that have different needs in different ways to help them deliver the preventative care that they want to their, the populations that they care for. And so that can look different in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting piece of how this rolls out and how technology is getting integrated or getting built from a preventative perspective, kind of from the ground up. There are some folks in the space who say we can't operate within the kind of traditional system of quote unquote sick care. The incentives are off. It's never going to work in the way that we envision the impact we'd like to have. Others are saying we are going to integrate into this, the hospital healthcare system as it currently exists and hope to change it. It sounds like you're saying like, hey, we are the technology provider. However, this client partner wants to use it, that's kind of up to them versus building the future of preventative care.
That's right. And there's a lot of other use cases actually outside of preventative care that we have partners exploring. Because if you take a step back, like what we've really done is built the first platform that's capable of comprehensively measuring a human, like physiologically, and then making some prediction about what that human might look like in some period of time in the future. And so the other thing you can think about it as the first platform that can actually quantitatively measure what's changing in a body. right? And that has a lot of other useful applications. As you can imagine, let's say I want to get an understanding of what's changed after you have a surgery. Well, if I can measure everything about you before and after cost effectively, I really get an understanding of whether or not my surgery was successful or what impacts it had. The same thing could go for a drug. If you want to quantify the impact of any intervention, and this is on a personalized basis, like one drug affects one person different than it does another. But if you really want to actually quantify those things and not just generalize it based on a clinical study that was run once 50 years ago, and this is where we get to like true personalized medicine, then you need the ability to quantify change in an individual. And that's fundamentally the novel thing that we've done that enables these other kind of more exciting scenarios.
Maybe back to the business model aspect for a little bit. You said looking at these partners, you have partnerships kind of internationally that you're discussing rolling out.
Signed a number of them. We have actively integrated with very large healthcare systems internationally already that are this is actually being deployed and piloted right now.
And from that standpoint, will it not be a kind of direct to consumer product in the way that a concierge or membership preventative care clinic to this point have come up and said, like, this is, in their words, right, the future of preventative care? You more so see it as a technology product that's being sold into.
I think both are viable. I think the problem with going to direct to consumer that I see is like in order for this to be useful, we're talking about measuring, and I'm not just talking about a whole body scan. Like you're just doing a whole body scan. I think that's different than what we're doing. And I don't think it's sufficient. But if you're really talking about measuring this much information about a body, if you don't have a tool like that we've built that can summarize a person's greatest risks automatically, that a doctor can easily digest, right? You really need clinician buy-in for this to be useful, right? Because what we've found is we have clinicians who, instead of people going to their office for a physical exam, they just come to us and we handle their entire patient panel. And they've told us that they can actually care for more patients now because of this, because they're effectively outsourcing the physical exam to us because they can focus on the patients who have the highest risk. And we give them a report saying, here's the biggest changes in health in your population. And here's a person whose risks have changed and you can focus on them. So we think of us as more of a tool that amplifies a doctor's ability to see more patients if it's used correctly. So if you're just giving this directly to a patient, right, and they don't know what to do with it, they can't order the next test that would be required to take the next step in identifying a potentially serious issue that a patient has, it's not that useful, right? And so I think that there's three kind of parties that you really need to include if you want this to become ubiquitous. One, especially in the United States, is one is the payers, the other is the clinicians, and the other is the individuals, right? And it's different in every country you want to go to. But I do think that the one thing that is, I think, consistent, regardless of the country or the system you're looking at, is you want to make sure the clinician and the patient find value and utility in this.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And laying it out that way, it makes a ton of sense. If I got this information and didn't know what to do with it next or didn't have access to the tests or the scripts or the follow-ups, it really doesn't serve me that well from an individual perspective. Thinking about this, if we zoom out a little bit, we've kind of touched on it a little bit to this point, just in terms of who can afford these types of services or technologies, even if you look at it from like a whole body scan or from what you're doing at Q or to anything else that kind of falls into this kind of futuristic, preventative, personalized, even longevity, anti-aging. There's typically a lot of pushback saying, well, this is only for rich people and this is only for people on the coasts. And it's really not a solution that can get the scale and really have an impact for those who need it. How do you kind of take that, respond to it, or even think about it relative to the impact that you're trying to have?
Yeah, sure. I think it's simple. If you're talking about offering this on top of a Siemens or GE or a Philips scanner, then that's absolutely correct. Those people are right. Like I said, the math is very simple. Do some research. Find out how many MRI scanners there are in the United States. Figure out what the spare capacity is on them. Then assume that they're open 12 hours a day. Like you can very quickly figure out, okay, there's just not enough capacity to scan everybody. And so that says, okay, well, we need a different tool then if we really want to make this ubiquitous for everybody. So, I mean, those naysayers are absolutely correct. And that's exactly why we knew we had to build the scanner. It's simply because you could just do some very quick math to realize, this is definitely only for rich people, just because there isn't enough capacity to handle an entire population in our scanners.
And then in terms of going forward, whether you it is integrating with the payers or the clinicians or going directly to the end user. From a cost perspective, do you have any idea what that looks like in terms of making it more accessible so it doesn't become another technology that is kind of out of reach for most people?
I can tell you that we know for sure we can offer Gemini as a service to a person for less than what insurance pays to reimburse you for the physical exam you get today.
Is that already being offered, or are people paying for that? Are there members?
There are places where we are, yes.
And then if we kind of look ahead a little bit and maybe a couple more questions before we get you out of here down this path, rolling it out to the extent that somebody would go to their doctor and this would be the kind of experience that they have. Do you have a sense for what that timeline looks like? Or, you mentioned earlier within a decade that this becomes fairly accessible, or
It's largely dependent on how fast we can scale up the manufacturing of our scanner, because that is the bottleneck. The rest scales. Like we don't have a problem with like biochemistry analysis. It's not like we have limited capacity as far as DNA sequencing throughput or gathering of vitals, right? None of that is a problem. The missing piece is how do you gather the anatomical portion cost effectively, scalably, reproducibly, so that you can automate the analysis of it correctly. And once you've done those things, then, like I said, a whole body scan, a whole body MRI should cost less than blood work until the next paradigm of blood work that can be done at the point of care. Because you have to remember, like, you have to ship a sample, you have to send it somewhere, you have to wait, it requires human labor in the lab. As that gets automated, all of these measurements really, most of the measurement really should be a zero margin business. There's just huge profits in diagnostic medicine. But if we think of really the gathering of information about our bodies as really should be approaching a zero margin business, where this is just the baseline information we collect to take care of our population, like then really I think that where money should be made really in a healthy healthcare system really should be on interventions. And I can understand like in a public payer system, like you're gonna have to take what the system pays, but I always think there should be a private option if people are willing to pay more. But I do think the baseline of what information is collected in terms of a physical exam, like that should be roughly standardized across everybody.
and this might even be a step too far into the future, but it's almost something that when you think about this shift in technology and the idea of prevention and making this technology more accessible, that I think some people kind of fantasize or look forward to a future where it's like you get out of bed and you step in front of the closet or the mirror or a scanner on the floor, and all of these diagnostics are happening. I know you see.
Well, I can tell you, we've looked at this, and I can tell you that there just needs to be material science breakthroughs in order for that. We've hit the theoretical limit. It gets impossible to build a scanner that's more efficient than we have, just to would violate the laws of physics and information theory. So we were brushing up against that limit. So until it will require material science breakthroughs or hardware engineering, like automation, mostly material science breakthroughs in order to make like a scanner in your house possible. But we've now hit the limit of algorithmically what you can do.
And then in terms of whether that happens right at the doctor or at a QBio location or maybe someday at the home, the idea that the notification is going to your doctor that says this was discovered. A notification is going to a restaurant to say this is the meal plan that this person should eat and it's being delivered to your house. Do you see a world where it is that automated, that optimized to the level of personalized and prevention, where these things are happening in the way where we don't have to think about our health, we don't have to think about these interventions, we don't have to think about the tests and the diagnostics, or even what you just said, given that there needs to be material breakthroughs, that technology doesn't exist. Is that all fantasy?
Absolutely not. Actually, I can say with 100% certainty that future that you just outlined is absolutely possible. I don't know what the material science breakthroughs are going to be to get one of these in your home, but in terms of having more, put it this way, like if you think about it like this, you think about the scale you would need to, let's say, like scan the entire US population annually, or even biannually, if you think about it, there's about 3,000 people per gas station in the United States, right? So if we can set up one of our sites for every 15,000 people in the United States, that means we're 5 times more scalable than gas stations in the United States. But that gives you a sense of kind of actually how many of these things you need to build to cover a population. And so that's a significant manufacturing scale. But any scenario you just outlined in terms of the alerting, that's we could do that today, to be perfectly honest. It's just not as scalable without our technology. So I think the bigger question when it comes to this proactive alerts going out is not a matter of necessarily if we could, because I'm sure we can. It's should we? And I don't know that those questions often get asked enough today because more and more things that are science fiction are becoming science facts. And I think there's more often is like this question of should we versus can we? And I think there's a whole bunch of privacy issues that I think are very important in the world you just outlined. But at the same time, like I think that the idea of you having a personalized agent that could reach out to your doctor when something was discovered that was worrisome, or it would reach out to your grocery delivery and make sure that certain kinds of foods are avoided based on your health, that's almost inevitable. Like that's not even a stretch of the imagination at this point.
Yeah, I think this perspective, taking and having the optimistic viewpoint, the that this is inevitable, that it's really a matter of, as you phrase it, like should we, and maybe when does that come into play, is certainly more so the world that I want to be living in terms of solving these problems versus positioning as something that we can't or shouldn't figure out. So having the choice and kind of opting on the optimism side of that is definitely encouraging. And maybe the last thing related to this, obviously, as you look at it and you're doing the math and you're thinking about how do we scan and serve as many people as possible and what would it take to get there, this path of building the technology, having the software integrate, being able to do the diagnostics and have the AI behind that to read and really make it so that doctors can focus on not this frontline triage, but kind of solving problems down the line. Are there other technologies or problems that you look at as right now being the far and away the things that we should be solving or the solutions that we should be tackling that really transform healthcare rather in the same way that you've kind of set out to do with QBio?
Yeah, I mean, a big one for me is, like I said, is much cheaper and better point of care biochemical analysis. I think, but I know there's people working on that, but I think that is a big one. But I mean, that's the one major thing that we are not focused on. That we're when we think about the future that we want to build, that we're looking at a number of other companies that are making a lot of inroads there that we think are promising.
Awesome. And then we'll get you out here on this. For folks that are interested, that obviously have taken a great interest in this conversation or focused on this area in general, is there anything that we should look out for or you could share about what's next at Q and where we should follow along?
Yeah, I mean, we'll be in the next few weeks. We'll be making some major announcements, and so stay tuned on our website for those. I think, but in general, in the history of civilization I'm aware of, information wants to be free, right? And the controlling of information. And right now, this idea that there's resistance against people having more information about their bodies, that kind of paternal view of information about our own bodies, whether it was information about bodies or something else, historically that just hasn't really lasted, right? That's just been temporary resistance. I think it's inevitable the amount of information we're going to collect about our bodies, and we can accept that, or we can put our head in the sand and pretend that it's not coming. But I think that that's really what this is about. Do we believe that the future of healthcare involves more information or less? And anybody who says it's less, I think they'll find themselves on the wrong end of history.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap. We'll certainly see it will play out. Like you said, more likely to fall on that side than the other. But yeah, I appreciate you making some time to join us here today. Really excited to share this conversation. We'll certainly be following along as you continue to roll out what's next at Q.
Great. Thanks, Joe. It was a pleasure.
One more thing before you head out. Help us spread the word. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, or share this episode with a friend. And if you like conversations like this, you'll love the Fitt Insider newsletter. We send it every Tuesday. The link is in the description. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you back here next week.